So Día de Muertos is almost upon us, and in this video I ask the question, can Goth subculture, including Mexican subculture which is heavily influenced by Día de Muertos, can Goth subculture be a form of political resistance? And if so, how can Goth resist colonialism and imperialism, including cultural hegemony? So I'll be exploring Mexican Goth, a bit of political theory, and having some fun exploring Día de Muertos as well. Okay, that tastes pretty good. That's a sugar skull. So I'm about to head out to my second weekend of clubbing, this time to El Real Under, yet again, rocking some fashions from a wonderful store here called Horror Boutique. And one thing I absolutely love about Mexican City Goth is it is definitely a blend with local indigenous traditions. You have a lot of the Día de Muertos influence going back to indigenous Mayan and Aztec death and spirit worship. So I love that this is a distinctly Latine Gothic style. And personally, as someone of Guatemalan heritage, I feel very drawn to this. Now, I actually commissioned a corset today from Horror Boutique. So they're making a purple corset, and I plan on wearing that for Día de Muertos when I actually visit my grandparents' grave on the Day of the Dead, which is November 1st. And as I have been living in Guatemala and Mexico for the last 3 months and learning a lot about the politics here, I'm also very interested in the question of whether Goth and the Día de Muertos, Day of the Dead influences you see in Goth subculture can be a form of political resistance to oppression. To me, Goth is a form of resistance to capitalism. It is a form of resistance. To me, the decadence of Goth, this is kombucha, by the way, but I had to keep up appearances. The decadence of Goth is tied closely to this resistance as an marginalized peoples, whether it might be working class or people of color, saying we can be fabulous too. And as a trans person, who's some of the first trans people that I looked up to were black and brown trans folks in the Vogue ballroom culture, I see a direct parallel between the way that ballroom culture emulates realness of how fabulous can you look, like the cover of a magazine, and Goth's emulation of high fashion as a form of resistance. Now, if we look at subcultural scholars who've examined the Goth scene from the inside, most famously Paul Hodkinson, who wrote Goth, Identity, Style, and Subculture in 2002, and then more recently, Routledge Music Studies published Goth from Sound to Subculture, which included one of the DJs from a club that I used to go to, Shampoo, which hosted Dracula's Ball. So these both explore the ways in which Goth subculture is a resistance to dominant culture, that Goth is, especially in the book From Sound to Subculture, it explores how Goth ritual, including the Goth ritual of spending 3 to 4 hours getting ready to go out. It is now past midnight, and I've yet to head to the club. I was shopping at about 5:30 p.m., so I've been engaging in the Goth ritual of gothing up, shopping, doing my makeup, doing my nails, looking fabulous for hours now. So as I engaged in this ritual, of donning my Goth armor, hours of getting ready to go out to a club so that I can enjoy being surrounded by other people who enjoy this same ritual of dressing up to be fabulous, to be decadent, to be dark. To me, that is a form of anti-capitalism. That is a form of resistance, because I am saying that even if I am of the marginalized class, even if I am trans and Latina, even if I am disabled and not of the capitalist dominant class, I can be fabulous. I can be surrounded by people celebrating. I can be surrounded by people celebrating our realness and fabulosity. And that, to me, is resistance. Earlier in this video, I touched on the concept of cultural hegemony. And I want to return to that and give a more thorough definition and explanation. So, if you're not expecting politics in this discussion of Goth, you can skip ahead. But here I'm going to go a bit into Marxist philosophy and some of Chomsky's ideas about hegemony and soft power, and how Goth, especially Goth in colonized countries and in marginalized communities that are under the imperialist yoke of American and European imperialism, I find that Goth is a very fitting case study of resistance to cultural hegemony. So, cultural hegemony by the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci is defined as the domination of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class, which manipulates the culture of that society, beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and mores, so that the imposed ruling class, and in this case capitalist class, worldview becomes the accepted cultural norm. And here I really want to talk about worldview, because this, in the time we are in now, post-neoliberalism, soft power is the way that imperial centers like the United States and Washington, D.C. sets the global agenda, that they allow culture rather than the threat of military force, everything from pop TV shows and music to NGOs and exporting McDonald's, anything really that it reflects American values, replaces local culture, local food, local music. Now, I do want to provide a more nuanced approach to this, because I don't think necessarily that Goth, which, yes, has much of its origins in imperialist UK and the Americas, was not exactly a hegemonic cultural export. That I'm really talking about the mass media, the media that the imperial core, the capitalist class, the newspapers and journals owned by Jeff Bezos, the Washington Post, everything from that to NGOs like AmeriCorps, and then pop culture TV owned by the major corporations. Now these are exporting hegemony. So here I'm going to return a bit more to theory. So in America, we often think of ourselves as having an open and free press, an open society. But as Noam Chomsky, in discussing soft power and cultural hegemony, has explained, that the mainstream media is able to create a colorful and lively debate that presents itself as encompassing vast different political worldviews, and that we as consumers are able to choose between these different views and feel like we have agency and political freedom. Now, the mainstream media also does a good job of excluding anything from the accepted range of political viewpoints that would lead to radical transformative change of existing institutions and lead to social justice, lead to an end to capitalist oppression, lead to an end of capitalism. So how Goth fits into this picture is Goth has, for almost all of its history, except some very brief moments in the limelight, been a subculture that is fully in opposition and not dominated by and not spread through mainstream media. Goth has always been spread through the clubs, the bars, the shops, the flyers that people pass out, and, was one of the early adopters of internet culture, internet forums. NetGoth is very much helped spread Goth subculture into the 21st century, independent of major record labels or mainstream MTV type attention. So here in Mexico and in Vietnam, although I'm going to focus more on Mexico, Goth has assumed a localized aspect to its culture. That Goth has been able to adopt the kind of working class resistance to cultural hegemony from the imperial centers of UK and the United States and blend it with indigenous and anti-colonial sources here in Mexico in order to present and create a uniquely Mexican style of Goth subculture, which I've been observing is alive and well. Holy, there's a lot of Goth here. And I think one of the most obvious blends that we see in the Goth scene here is the blend with the Día de Muertos, which is in itself a blend of indigenous spirit worship and death worship and Santa Muerte, the kind of indigenous death gods, and the Catholic, Gothic obsession with death and martyrdom and ancestors. So here in Mexican Goth, you see a lot of Day of Dead, Dia de Muertos influence. And you've probably seen, even if you don't know her by name, portrayals of Mexican Calavera Catrina, which was a parody of upper-class Mexican Spanish colonial style that was created by Jose Guadalupe Posada, a Mexican illustrator, to parody colonial fashion and style. And we've seen, even if we don't know her name, Catrina in portrayals of Dia de Muertos, face makeup, extravagant hats, extravagant veils, flowers in the hair, the over-the-top elegance, which is in itself a parody of ruling class, colonial, and later American imperialist norms. Goth certainly plays with this Calavera Catrina image. Another source that I wanted to talk about of a Mexican Goth that is quite famous is the industrial band Hocico. So, to quote from an interview with the band Hocico, the band is known for producing an aggressive style of electronic music, which they attribute to their experiences growing up and living in Mexico City. In a 2003 interview, the band stated, "We deal with a lot of violence. Sometimes you walk in Mexico City, you see a lot of it. It's about where we live and things that happen to us. We'd explode without the music." And Hocico, with albums like Signos de Aberración, has a very dark, sinister sound. But it is a sound that is a resistance to violence. It is a sound that is born out of an awareness of how imperialism, American imperialism, things like NAFTA, free trade, liberalism, capitalism has enforced a, lack of jobs, lack of food security, unemployment, violence as a result of lack of food and employment opportunities. That American imperialism is a big source of the violence in Mexico. And I think Hocico does a good job of portraying violence that is a good example of resistance to the source of that violence. So in their recent song Broken Empires, it has a very strong anti-racist message that refers to slavery and racism and exploitation of indigenous people. that it also refers to this soft power of cultural hegemony that convinces Mexican people that American cultural norms are good. So the lyrics of the song, I'll read the first two stanzas. Slaves, fading love, shades, darker tones, a vicious dream of control. So from the very beginning, we see references to slavery, to racism, to exploitation, to control of black and brown people. Your pleasure screams a loaded gun. Again, we have this hard power, this violence of domination. But then it moves towards soft power. It references snakes, hidden lies, beliefs to divide, a shallow speech to take aside, a piece of fiction to waste your life. And I don't think it's a stretch to say this shallow speech to take aside is very much in line with Chomsky talking about the shallow yet appealing and colorful debate that the mainstream media allows, but doesn't let us really see the sources of oppression and the full spectrum. Instead, these mainstream media sources provide beliefs to divide us, a piece of fiction to waste your life. I think Goth is often seen as escapist, and I want to move away from that it's not escapist, it is allowing us, not wasting our life or wasting our time through escapism, but allowing us to experience and imagine alternate realities that are resistance to capitalism, that are resistance to cultural hegemony. That, as I explored earlier, talking about my essay and the book Goth from Sound to Subculture, Goth music and Goth subculture is a form of ritual that lets us access alternate reality through art that dislocates and displaces time and space. We can imagine futures, pasts, and alternative presents that let us think beyond the small, colorful exchange of ideas in mainstream media and imagine something outside of the time and space we are in that might be grander and liberating, and at the same time Goth also lets us imagine dystopian and lets us see that the direction we're heading in might lead to nuclear war, environmental devastation. Those are huge themes in industrial and Goth music, is devastation, including in the music of bands like Hocico. So the next band I want to explore, who's also Mexico City based, but has a very different sound than Ministry, is Santa Sabina. Now this song has a very ethereal, neo-pagan, kind of romantic sound. And it's very hopeful. It's very much rooted in dream and dreaming of a better tomorrow, and also looking back at the past, including indigenous roots of Mexican tradition. The name itself, Santa Sabina, is a reference to a Mazatec shaman from Oaxaca, Mexico. And the lead singer, Rita Guerrero, was trained at a young age in traditional Mexican music and instruments. So the song Humo Canción that I want to focus on really explores these elements. In addition to her very soulful, spiritual singing, it has a shamanic incantation that is sampled in the song. And when they perform it live on stage, they actually perform a shamanic incantation, which I'll put a little video up of. So the lyrics are of the first stanza, La vida nunca termina, tus pasos acarician la tierra, and the life never ends, your feet caress the earth. It's very much of a kind of coming to terms with nature and humanity, that we are one, that we find immortality through being one with nature and the earth. Eres barro, palabra, tiempo. Eres flor, mañana eres cielo. Eres barro, so you are the dirt, the mud, the word, time. You are the flowers, and tomorrow you are the sky. So it's very much a song that is a beautiful ascension into immortality by becoming one with the earth, which this ascension to immortality is very much a Goth theme. This kind of looking at the past and the future, mañana, tomorrow, you become the sky, is very much also a very Goth theme. As I explored earlier, the concept and theory of the book Goth From Sound to Subculture is that Goth is a music and a subculture that is defined by rituals that displace and dislocate place and time in order to help us access alternate realities. And this song very much does that. It helps us think about dream. It references dreams in the song. And with the shamanic incantation and the pagan influences, certainly makes us feel lifted to an alternate reality. Regardless of your religious affiliation or beliefs, I feel a very strong spiritual connection when I listen to this song, and I am not a religious person. And one more thing I'll add is, while the song does not have explicitly political lyrics, there is definitely a political bent to the band and Rita Guerrero's background as a supporter of the Zapatistas, who were anti-capitalist, opposed to neoliberalism, who are opposed to those things. Rita Guerrero passed away of cancer, but throughout her life, the band fundraised for indigenous causes. As I mentioned, she was taught Mexican traditional music and as a young kid, and very much it is in the tradition of the Mexican Revolution, the early 1900s, where there was a look back at indigenous Mexican roots in the art, the music, the politics, and the culture. And I very much feel Humo Cancion is a song worth your time to check out. And next, I'll be talking about an artist from the Mexican diaspora who lives in Washington, D.C., Laya Monarez. So another band I want to reference is by Mexican-American front woman Laya Monarez, who I've actually interviewed for my blog. And she's based in the imperialist core of Washington, D.C., as a transgender Mexican indigenous identified activist. And in their songs for their band How to Get Killed, which is in fact a reference to hate violence, and she's working on some music about anti-trans hate violence. It includes a song about the city of God. And the lyrics include, "In a city so diseased by lies, why can't we just organize?" Again, referencing that soft power hegemony tells us lies that doesn't allow us to radically organize and mobilize, because we believe that somehow neoliberalism, liberal debate of ideas in our current democracy could lead to liberation. And I do think many trans people, especially white trans people who are not aware of intersectionality, who are not in line with Black Lives Matter and efforts to end racist policing and anti-trans violence against trans women of color, might buy into these liberal ideas of, oh, we can just vote our way to trans equality. But we've seen time and time again that fascist and capitalist forces are violent and lead to deaths of trans people and exploitation, unemployment, homelessness. That capitalism as we live under is simply not sustainable. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the goth scene is full of trans people, full of queer people, and as I've mentioned, neurodivergent people who also feel like they don't fit into ableist, transphobic, cis-sexist cultural norms. The principles of disability justice state that we're anti-capitalist by the very nature of having non-conforming body minds. That as we are seen as exploitable or expendable under capitalism, why can't we just organize? We can't let soft power of cultural hegemony keep us down. And I think goth gives us a way to imagine an alternative. Goth, to me, is a form of resistance, and to many others. And if you don't think goth is a form of resistance, I challenge you to come dance here in Mexico City and see why all these folks here are drawn to Goth subculture. So I'll be exploring this more in depth. I'm hoping to interview some local Goths, but if you have something you want to add, if you have a question, your own thoughts on why you like Goth, please leave a comment and take a moment to give it a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to get notified of future episodes. I feel inspired to make some more videos about Goth. If I get some positive feedback, I'll definitely make some more videos. So please, I love the comments. They mean a lot to me. And if you want to financially support me, you can do so at patreon.com/Kaylee Whalen.